The Valley of Silent Screams, Chapter 1. Into the Valley. The orders came just before dawn. Captain Harris spread the map across the hood of a jeep, his voice low but firm, as he pointed to the shaded area between two ridgelines. The valley was narrow, hemmed in by thick jungle and limestone cliffs, an isolated place deep in central Vietnam. According to command, it was a strategic location for temporary encampment. To the men, it was just another nameless stretch of wilderness that might hide Viet Cong tunnels, booby traps, or worse. By mid-morning, the platoon began their march. The sun burned hot overhead, yet the valley remained shrouded in a strange dimness. As they descended the trail, Sergeant Coleman noticed something unsettling. The air felt too still, too heavy. No birds sang in the canopy. No monkeys barked in the distance. Even the cicadas, which usually shrieked endlessly in the heat, were absent. The silence pressed against their ears until each soldier became uncomfortably aware of the sound of his own boots crunching on dried leaves. "Feels like a goddamn graveyard," muttered Private Ellis, wiping sweat from his brow. Coleman hushed him, but the thought stuck. A graveyard. That's exactly what the place felt like, an enormous tomb carved out of the jungle. The valley opened before them in a wide basin, flanked by cliffs, veined with vines and moss. A narrow river cut through its center, sluggish and dark, reflecting only a dim sheen of sky. Beyond the river stretched a forest of towering hardwoods, their trunks twisted and scarred by old fires. The Americans moved carefully, their rifles raised, eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. By noon, they set up camp near the riverbank. Harris ordered sandbags, stacked machine guns placed, and a perimeter established. Yet even with the camp prepared, the unease did not fade. Corporal Jensen, usually quick with jokes, fell uncharacteristically quiet. He fiddled with the safety of his M16, eyes darting nervously toward the cliffs. "It's too damn quiet," he said finally. "It ain't natural." That evening, the men gathered around their rations. The silence gnawed at them more than hunger. Every clink of a spoon, every cough, every whispered word sounded amplified in the valley, echoing strangely against the cliffs. Conversations faltered. Some of the younger soldiers stared into the jungle as though expecting the shadows to move. Private Ellis tried to break the tension. "Maybe the VC cleared this place out. Maybe we'll get a quiet night for once." No one laughed. As dusk fell, a fog drifted across the river, coiling around the camp like pale fingers. The forest grew darker faster than expected, the canopy swallowing the last of the light. Harris ordered lanterns lit, but the glow only made the fog appear thicker, the shadows deeper. The men prepared for night watch. Coleman and two others took the first shift. They sat at the edge of camp, listening. At first there was only the faint rustle of leaves, then gradually the rustling ceased. The silence returned heavier than before, as if the entire valley were holding its breath. Coleman felt his heartbeat in his throat. He tried to focus, telling himself it was just nerves. Yet when the wind shifted, he thought he heard something faint, like a moan carried on the breeze. He stiffened, straining to listen. The sound vanished. "Did you hear that?" he whispered to Private Lane. "Hear what like someone screaming, but soft." Lane shook his head uneasily. "I don't hear nothin'." But Coleman couldn't shake it. He stared into the fog until his eyes watered. The shapes of the trees blurred together, twisting into forms that seemed almost human. By midnight, the entire camp was restless. Some claimed to hear whispers. Others swore they felt the ground tremble under their boots, as if something moved deep beneath the soil. Harris barked at them to keep discipline, but even he seemed rattled. He smoked cigarette after cigarette, the glow of the ember revealing the tightness in his jaw. The valley seemed alive yet dead, at the same time breathing without breath, speaking without sound. And as the first night dragged on, the soldiers realized that whatever haunted this place was not the Viet Cong. It was something far older, something that had been waiting in silence long before they arrived. Extended narrative. The second half of the night was worse. Sleep was nearly impossible. Private Ellis tossed in his hammock, eyes darting toward the canopy. He swore he saw faces in the fog, blurred outlines staring back at him. When he blinked, they vanished, but the impression remained carved into his mind. Sergeant Coleman forced himself to stay awake. He had the uneasy sense that if he closed his eyes, the valley itself would swallow him whole. Every time he glanced at the river, he thought it shimmered unnaturally, as though something beneath its surface was moving. Once he thought he saw hands, pale skeletal hands, reaching just below the waterline. He refused to look again. The jungle had its own weight here, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to watch. The fog clung stubbornly, muffling every sound. Even when one soldier accidentally kicked over a tin cup, the clang seemed dull, swallowed instantly by the air. No echo, no rebound. The valley devoured sound. That absence gnawed at Harris the most. He remembered firefights where gunfire had rolled across hills for miles, where every burst of artillery thundered back in echoes. But here in this basin, sound simply ended. He realized with a creeping chill that even their own voices were dampened. The men spoke in whispers, not because they wanted to, but because the valley made them. By 0300, Private Lane cracked. He sat up suddenly, eyes wide. "They're screaming," he hissed. "You don't hear it. They're screaming right now." The other men jolted awake, rifles raised, hearts pounding. "What the hell are you talking about?" Coleman demanded. Lane pointed toward the cliffs. His finger trembled. "They're like they're buried inside the rock." Silence. Nothing but silence. And yet as the soldiers strained, some swore they caught it too, a distant muffled cry. Not loud, not sharp, but stretched thin like a soul, wailing from deep underground. "Jesus Christ," muttered Jensen, crossing himself. Harris stormed over, his temper flaring. "Enough! It's the goddamn wind. Get your shit together!" But the captain's voice cracked in the middle, betraying his own unease. The platoon fell into sullen silence. No one slept again that night. They sat with rifles across their laps, staring into fog that never lifted, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, it brought no relief. The valley looked different in daylight, worse somehow. The cliffs loomed taller, their surfaces etched with shapes that looked disturbingly like faces frozen mid-scream. The river lay still, blacker than ink, refusing to reflect the sun. The fog did not retreat. It simply hovered lower, clinging to the ground. Harris gave orders to patrol the perimeter, but the men dragged their feet. Each step into the forest felt like a step deeper into a nightmare. And as the day wore on, one truth became undeniable: the valley was not empty. It was watching them, listening, waiting. And somewhere in its silence, something was screaming. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Stone. Morning broke reluctantly over the valley. The mist did not lift so much as it clung heavy and wet to the ground, and the cliffs making the sun appear as a dim disk behind a veil of gray. The men of Harris's platoon stirred uneasily, faces pale, eyes shadowed by the restless night before. The silence had not left. It had deepened, like the valley itself was absorbing sound and swallowing it whole. Captain Harris barked orders to reassert discipline. He knew fear spread like infection. The men needed activity tasks, something to distract them from the valley's unnatural hush. He sent Sergeant Coleman with a patrol to sweep the basin's edge. The rest worked on reinforcing the perimeter. Rifles clinked against metal boots scraped rock, but every sound seemed too loud in the stillness. The patrol soon discovered a jagged opening at the base of the northern cliff. It yawned like a mouth dark and damp, framed by vines that swayed though there was no breeze. Coleman hesitated before signaling the others forward. They entered in pairs, flashlights flickering against slick stone walls. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, and with it came a faint murmur. At first, Coleman thought it was the echo of their own boots. But as the sound grew clearer, it carried the cadence of voices. Whispers layered upon whispers, too low to understand, too insistent to ignore. Private Lane froze, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "They're saying something. They're calling." "Shut it!" Coleman snapped through his own skin crawled. He strained his ears and caught a fragment words in Vietnamese, broken, mournful. He did not understand the language, but the tone was unmistakable: grief, anger, longing. One soldier swore he saw shadows slither along the walls, shapes that bent and stretched, but never matched the angle of their flashlights. Another stumbled back, claiming he felt fingers brush his arm. Panic flared, and Harris himself, who had entered to take control, ordered an immediate withdrawal. "Out now." As they scrambled from the cavern, Lane looked back and screamed. He insisted he saw faces pressing through the stone-charred, hollow-eyed mouths, open in silent wails. By the time the others turned, there was nothing but rock and shadow. They dragged Lane back to camp, his body shaking, lips muttering prayers. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Harris tried to reassure them it was stress, jungle madness, nothing more. But the valley disagreed. That night, the whispers returned stronger. They threaded through the fog, curling around tents and rifles, tugging at the men's sanity. Some heard pleas for help. Others heard accusations. A few claimed the voices called their names. Corporal Jensen woke in a sweat, his fingernails caked with wet red soil, though he had not left his cot. Private Ellis swore he dreamed of skeletons clawing their way from the riverbank. But when he woke, his boots were soaked as though he had walked through water. The men no longer trusted sleep. By midnight, the valley seemed to breathe. The cliffs groaned as though shifting, and faint vibrations pulsed beneath the ground. Then came the scream, not a human cry, but a chorus of them echoing from the cliffs themselves. The sound ripped through the camp, freezing every man where he stood. The lanterns flickered violently, and in their glow some swore they saw the stone faces emerge again, eyes blazing with sorrow and rage. A sentry collapsed. His rifle clattered to the dirt. When they rushed to him, his eyes were wide, fixed on the cliff. He gasped a single word, "faces," before falling silent, his mind broken. Captain Harris fought to hold his men together. He ordered everyone into defensive positions, though against what none could say. The valley had become a prison of whispers and stone, each breath of air heavy with ghosts. Even Harris, hardened by years of war, lit cigarette after cigarette, his hands trembling. Chapter 2 closed with the entire platoon staring toward the northern cliffs, waiting for dawn, though none believed daylight would save them. In the Valley of Silent Screams, the night was not the only thing that hunted them. The stone itself seemed alive, and its whispers promised that this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Stone. Morning broke reluctantly over the valley. The mist did not lift so much as it clung heavy and wet to the ground, and the cliffs making the sun appear as a dim disk behind a veil of gray. The men of Harris's platoon stirred uneasily, faces pale, eyes shadowed by the restless night before. The silence had not left. It had deepened, like the valley itself was absorbing sound and swallowing it whole. Captain Harris barked orders to reassert discipline. He knew fear spread like infection. The men needed activity tasks, something to distract them from the valley's unnatural hush. He sent Sergeant Coleman with a patrol to sweep the basin's edge. The rest worked on reinforcing the perimeter. Rifles clinked against metal boots, scraped rock, but every sound seemed too loud in the stillness. The patrol soon discovered a jagged opening at the base of the northern cliff. It yawned like a mouth dark and damp, framed by vines that swayed though there was no breeze. Coleman hesitated before signaling the others forward. They entered in pairs, flashlights flickering against slick stone walls. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, and with it came a faint murmur. At first, Coleman thought it was the echo of their own boots. But as the sound grew clearer, it carried the cadence of voices. Whispers layered upon whispers, too low to understand, too insistent to ignore. Private Lane froze, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "They're saying something. They're calling." "Shut it!" Coleman snapped through his own skin crawled. He strained his ears and caught a fragment words in Vietnamese, broken, mournful. He did not understand the language, but the tone was unmistakable: grief, anger, longing. One soldier swore he saw shadows slither along the walls, shapes that bent and stretched, but never matched the angle of their flashlights. Another stumbled back, claiming he felt fingers brush his arm. Panic flared, and Harris himself, who had entered to take control, ordered an immediate withdrawal. "Out now." As they scrambled from the cavern, Lane looked back and screamed. He insisted he saw faces pressing through the stone-charred, hollow-eyed mouths, open in silent wails. By the time the others turned, there was nothing but rock and shadow. They dragged Lane back to camp, his body shaking, lips muttering prayers. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Harris tried to reassure them it was stress, jungle madness, nothing more. But the valley disagreed. That night, the whispers returned stronger. They threaded through the fog, curling around tents and rifles, tugging at the men's sanity. Some heard pleas for help. Others heard accusations. A few claimed the voices called their names. Corporal Jensen woke in a sweat, his fingernails caked with wet red soil, though he had not left his cot. Private Ellis swore he dreamed of skeletons clawing their way from the riverbank. But when he woke, his boots were soaked as though he had walked through water. The men no longer trusted sleep. By midnight, the valley seemed to breathe. The cliffs groaned as though shifting, and faint vibrations pulsed beneath the ground. Then came the scream, not a human cry, but a chorus of them echoing from the cliffs themselves. The sound ripped through the camp, freezing every man where he stood. The lanterns flickered violently, and in their glow some swore they saw the stone faces emerge again, eyes blazing with sorrow and rage. A sentry collapsed. His rifle clattered to the dirt. When they rushed to him, his eyes were wide, fixed on the cliff. He gasped a single word, "faces," before falling silent, his mind broken. Captain Harris fought to hold his men together. He ordered everyone into defensive positions, though against what none could say. The valley had become a prison of whispers and stone, each breath of air heavy with ghosts. Even Harris, hardened by years of war, lit cigarette after cigarette, his hands trembling. Chapter 2 closed with the entire platoon staring toward the northern cliffs, waiting for dawn, though none believed daylight would save them. In the Valley of Silent Screams, the night was not the only thing that hunted them. The stone itself seemed alive, and its whispers promised that this was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The River of Echoes. The third day in the valley dawned no brighter than the last. The fog clung heavier, thicker, and the men looked like silhouettes moving through milk. Exhaustion bent their backs and dulled their eyes. Harris's platoon was no longer the sharp-edged machine that had landed with confidence. They were shadows of soldiers haunted before a battle had even begun. Harris ordered a recon toward the river that cut through the valley floor. They needed water, and more importantly, They needed a reason, any reason, to believe the valley could still be explained. Maybe the river would be proof of something ordinary. Flowing waterfish, the simple smell of mud. Anything but the whispers. The patrol reached the river by midday. It did not look like salvation. The current slid too slow, heavy as syrup, the water dark, carrying an oily sheen that shimmered in the dim light. The trees along the banks bent toward it, their roots gnarled and swollen, as if feeding on something beneath the surface. Private Ellis knelt and dipped his canteen. The water smelled metallic like blood. He gagged, but before he could comment, Lane whispered, "Listen." The river was not silent. Beneath the gurgle of current, there were voices, low, drawn out, distorted by the water. They rose and fell like a chant. Some of the men claimed they heard Vietnamese words. Others heard English. Harris only heard the tone accusing, mourning, never ceasing. When Ellis lifted his canteen, he froze. His reflection stared back, but the face was wrong. Burned, blistered with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. He screamed and dropped the canteen. The river swallowed it whole, the ripples spreading like laughter. Jensen swore violently and backed away. "This place ain't right. It's poison." But the river would not release them so easily. That night, when the platoon camped nearby, the current began to glow faintly. Pale blue light pulsed beneath the surface as though 1,000 fireflies were trapped inside. The men watched in horrified silence as shapes began to form bodies. Dozens, maybe hundreds, their outlines wavering in the water. Some looked like Vietnamese villagers. Others wore American uniforms. All drifted together in the current, eyes wide, mouths opening and closing in noiseless screams. Lane broke first. He waded into the river shouting, "We can pull them out! We can save them!" Harris and Coleman wrestled him back, but not before he emerged with scratches across his chest as though unseen hands had clawed him. His blood ran into the river, and the glowing shapes shuddered in response, pressing closer to the surface. The whispers grew louder as the night stretched on. The river spoke in 100 voices, none clear, all relentless. Harris lit another cigarette, inhaling deep to steady his nerves. The smoke did nothing to hide the smell of wet decay rising from the water. At dawn, they found Private Ellis missing. His boots stood neatly by the riverbank. His rifle lay in the mud. His body was nowhere to be seen, but footprints led into the water and stopped at the edge. In the current for just a moment, Harris swore he saw Ellis's face drifting past, eyes wide, mouth open, pleading. Then it was gone. The men no longer argued. They knew the valley was not just jungle and rock. It was something older, hungrier, built from blood and memory. The river had claimed one of them, and it would not stop. Every man felt it. They were no longer just soldiers on patrol. They were prisoners in a place that did not forgive. By the time they packed camp, none dared to look back at the river. But its sound followed them, whispers, always whispers, promising that the echoes would never end. Chapter 4. Night of the Hollow Eyes. Night returned with a cruelty that none of them were prepared for. The jungle fell silent far too quickly, as if every living thing knew to hide. Harris had led his reduced platoon deeper into the valley, away from the cursed river, but the whispers followed them like a disease carried in the mist. They were thinner in number now, missing. Ellis missing Faith. Men carried their rifles like crutches, not weapons. Each step sank into mud that clung as though it had hands of its own. The sun had barely set when the fog thickened into walls. Coleman swore he could see shapes in the haze, faces pressed against glass, watching. Every time he blinked, the shapes shifted. He stopped speaking after an hour, lips tight, eyes hollow. Harris noticed, but said nothing. He had no words that could soothe what they were all seeing. By midnight, the camp was set, though calling it a camp was generous. They huddled beneath rotting tarps, fireless, hungry. No one dared to cook, for the smell would give them away, or worse, invite the things that stalked them. Lane muttered a prayer in whispers, rocking slightly, as if his body remembered a rhythm from childhood. His voice cracked, and the jungle seemed to echo it back like mocking. Then came the eyes. At first, Harris thought it was fireflies, points of light blinking in the tree line. But fireflies didn't hover in pairs, didn't burn white, didn't move with the steadiness of a predator. Dozens of them appeared then. Hundreds circling the camp, hollow eyes glowing faintly, their shapes hidden by mist. Some were high in the branches. Others crawled low, close to the ground, watching. The men froze. No one breathed loud enough to be noticed. And yet the eyes moved closer. The air stank of rot and damp ashes. Lane broke again, whispering, "They're here for us." Jensen slapped him silent, but the damage was done. The eyes surged closer as if summoned by sound. From the mist, figures began to step forward. Not solid, not human, but outlines of men burned into the air. Some carried rifles that dripped with blood. Some wore American helmets, others Vietnamese conical hats. All their faces were empty, just those glowing hollow eyes. They did not move with the shuffle of the living, but with the pull of memory gliding, their mouths opening and closing in perfect silence. Coleman lifted his weapon and fired. The muzzle flash lit the fog, and for that second, Harris saw it clearly. Ellis was among them. His skin peeled, his eyes burning holes, his mouth gaping as if he was still screaming beneath water. Harris's chest locked tight. Coleman kept firing until the magazine clicked empty, but the bullets passed through smoke. The figures did not bleed. They only came closer. The fog pressed in, choking, and the platoon panicked. Men stumbled into each other, shouting, breaking formation. The eyes swarmed around them, and though no hand touched Harris, he felt fingers dragging across his skin, cold and endless. His ears filled with voices, not English, not Vietnamese, but the sound of grief given form. Mothers crying, children wailing, men begging for mercy that never came. Jensen fell to his knees, clawing at his helmet. "Get them out of my head." He smashed his skull against a rock until blood streaked his face, but the whispers only grew louder. Harris dragged him back, his hands shaking his body weaker than it had ever felt in battle. Then, as suddenly as it began, the figures withdrew. The eyes faded one by one, swallowed into the mist. Silence returned heavier than before. The men collapsed into exhausted heaps, too broken to speak. No one slept. They sat until dawn, staring at the tree line, waiting for the eyes to return. When morning came, Harris counted his men. 2 more were gone. Their rifles remained. Their boots stood where they had been left. But the soldiers themselves were simply missing, taken into the fog. On the ground nearby, Harris found a single set of bloody fingernail marks carved into the dirt, pointing toward the jungle. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The valley was not killing them like a normal enemy. It was consuming them piece by piece, memory by memory, until none of them would remain. Only the hollow eyes would endure, staring forever. That night, the men did not speak as they moved. They did not pray. They were past prayer. Harris knew what they were then, now not soldiers on patrol, but men walking already into their graves, guided by whispers and watched by the eyes of the dead. Chapter 5. The Last Echo. The valley lay in complete silence, yet that silence was heavier than any scream. For days, the American platoon had dwindled, men lost in ambushes, others vanishing without trace, their voices carried away by the choking mist that hung low across the ground. Now only 6 men remained, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights, their nerves shredded by the unseen horrors. Sergeant Harris tried to keep order, but his words no longer carried the authority of a leader. The men didn't look at him when he barked commands. They looked into the fog as though expecting shadows to reach out and drag them away. The jungle seemed to be feeding on their fear alive and listening, every branch bending toward them, every whisper of wind carrying the echoes of the dead. Private Mallory clutched his rifle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Sarge," he muttered, "I swear I heard Jensen last night. He's gone, but I heard him calling my name." His voice cracked, desperate, like a child admitting to seeing ghosts in his bedroom. Harris didn't answer. He too had heard Jensen, though the man's body had been found burned and twisted after the napalm strike. As they pushed deeper into the valley, the air grew heavier, suffocating. The mist throbbed in rhythm with their footsteps, as if the land itself had a pulse. And in the middle of it all stood something unnatural. A grove of trees bent inward, their twisted trunks forming a circle like an open mouth. It was here the platoon stopped, unable to move forward or back. "Don't you feel it?" whispered Corporal Diaz. His eyes darted in every direction. "It's like the ground's breathing." He was right. The soil beneath them shifted faintly, inhaling and exhaling, as though they stood on the chest of some buried giant. Suddenly the silence broke. Not with screams, but with echoes of screams. Voices from battles past, distorted and layered, filled the valley. Men who had died here long before Americans. French, even ancient warriors, cried out all at once. The soldiers covered their ears, but it did nothing. The sound was inside their heads. Mallory dropped his weapon and fell to his knees. "Make it stop, please, God, make it stop!" He clawed at his own face until blood ran down his cheeks. Harris grabbed him, but Mallory was beyond saving. In a frenzy, he bolted into the grove's dark circle. The mist swallowed him whole, and no sound of his footsteps followed. Only silence. The remaining 5 soldiers stood paralyzed. Their training meant nothing here. This was not war, it was damnation. Then, through the mist, came figures. Not Viet Cong fighters, not enemies with rifles. These were shadows shaped like men, their faces blank, their movements slow and deliberate. Yet the Americans recognized something in them, the posture, the helmets, the silhouettes. They were soldiers, ghosts of their own fallen comrades, returning not as protectors, but as hunters. Corporal Diaz screamed and fired wildly into the mist. The bullets seemed to vanish mid-air, swallowed by the valley itself. The shadows closed in, and Diaz's body convulsed as though pulled apart by unseen hands. His scream stretched long, then cut short, leaving only silence once more. Harris felt his mind cracking. He knew this valley wasn't just a battlefield, it was a graveyard that refused to rest. A place where every death was remembered, replayed, and forced upon the living. This was why the locals called it cursed. The jungle didn't forget. The jungle consumed. One by one, the shadows reached for the men. No bullets, no prayers, no courage could save them. The valley claimed them in silence, each scream transformed into another echo feeding the land. In the end, only Harris remained. A lone rifle trembling in his hands, he stared at the circle of trees. The mist parted just enough for him to see faces in the fog, countless faces of the dead staring back at him. Jensen, Diaz, Mallory. Even men he'd never met, soldiers from wars fought centuries before. They all looked at him with hollow eyes. A single voice spoke not from one mouth, but from all of them in unison. "You will never leave." The mist surged forward, and Harris was swallowed whole. The valley fell silent once more. Only the jungle remained breathing, waiting for the next intruders who dared step into its cursed embrace.